Hey guys! Tonight we're slipping behind the gilded facade of ancient Rome, where emperors wore laurels and smiled for statues but whispered like wolves when the statues weren't looking. We're not outside among the cheering crowds or the shouting senators. No, tonight we're inside the palace. Not in the throne room, but somewhere quieter, behind a curtain, in the shadow of a column. You're not here to lead or command. You're just here to watch, to notice, because this place, as grand as it seems, runs on secrets more than ceremony. The tiles beneath your feet are polished, yes, but listen closely. They echo with footsteps that have never been recorded. Words never written down, stories too soft to survive history's roar, unless you're willing to lean in and listen. And before we truly begin, I want to say something. If you find yourself enjoying these slow journeys into history, feel free to tap the like button and subscribe, but only if it brings you a bit of peace at the end of your day. Leave a little comment too, if you'd like. Just your name, where you're tuning in from, and what time the night finds you. I always find it oddly comforting, knowing someone out there is listening quietly from a city I've never seen, or a time zone I can barely imagine. Now, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or let the silence in, tuck yourself in comfortably. Tonight's story will take its time. You stir awake as a pale Roman dawn pushes its way through the tall slit of a palace window, brushing against the dusty corner where you've slept on a mat barely wide enough to turn over on. There is no feather pillow, no flowing curtain, just a folded cloak beneath your head and the distant rhythmic sound of sandals moving over marble. They are cautious footsteps, not lazy or loud. You'll come to recognize them soon, the sound of someone trying not to be noticed. That's what life here teaches first. Not who to trust, not who to serve, but how not to be seen. The imperial palace isn't one palace at all, but many rooms strung together like pearls on a crooked thread. Courtyards open into shaded porticos. Servant corridors run beneath banquet halls where last night's wine still stains the tiles. Statues look down from alcoves with wide, knowing eyes. The gods are everywhere here, or at least their marble replicas are, watching over men who no longer believe in anything but their own voices. You are one of many lowly attendants, and while your name may never reach a scroll, you know everything. You see who leaves the emperor's chamber when they shouldn't. You hear which nobleman argues in hushed tones in the mosaic garden. You catch glances exchanged between a general and a senator's wife and tuck them away like secrets in a fold of your memory. That's your true task here, not to clean, not to serve, but to witness. And this morning something already feels off. The air hangs heavy with the scent of last night's incense, but underneath that sweetness, something sour lingers. Spoiled wine, perhaps, or a lie that hasn't yet been told. A pigeon coos from the roof. Somewhere a slave drops a metal goblet and whispers a prayer to avoid punishment. The palace is still waking up, but it never really sleeps, not truly. The walls have ears, the curtains have eyes, and somewhere someone is always watching someone else. You stretch quietly, careful not to creak the wicker mat. Outside the servant quarters, the halls begin to hum with soft movement. Today, like every day, you'll walk among gods in human form, but you'll see their feet of clay. You'll hear their petty jealousies and panicked laughter, their whispered threats and forced apologies. You'll see the emperor himself, not as a statue on a coin, but as a man who bites his fingernails when he's nervous, who sneaks honeyed dates at night like a guilty child. And you'll learn the unspoken truth that shapes this entire empire. Rome is ruled not by strength, but by performance. And as you step into the marbled corridor, a light breeze swirls from the open courtyard. It smells of olive trees and burnt bread, and the faintest touch of rosewater from the Empress's bath chamber. You move slowly, deliberately, just as you've been taught, because here, even your silence is part of the show. The corridor curved like a snake, always just enough shadow to make you wonder who might be watching from the other end. You stepped lightly, not out of fear, but out of habit, the same way a cat does when it isn't quite sure if the dog is sleeping. The stones beneath your feet were cold even in the Roman summer. Polished marble never seemed to hold warmth, only reflected it back in quiet disapproval. You passed a wall lined with painted panels, scenes of gods banqueting and kings conquering, but you had long stopped seeing them. What mattered wasn't the paint on the walls, but the people who brushed too close to them. You caught sight of Cassius, one of the higher-ranking slaves, crossing the atrium ahead of you. His tunic was sharper than yours, and the thin gold pin at his shoulder told you he was close to the chamberlain. He didn't look your way. He never did. Not because he disliked you. No one disliked you, not directly, but in this place looking was dangerous. A glance could imply knowledge. Knowledge could suggest involvement, and involvement could get you accused of something you hadn't even heard about. So people moved like ships in fog, close but never touching, each pretending the others were just furniture, just echoes. Your task this morning, like most mornings, was undefined. That was the way of it. You were told you were here to assist with laundry or sweeping or messores, but those were just the alibis that covered your true function. You were there to be present, to observe, not officially, of course. The emperor didn't hand out scrolls that said "spy on my senators," but everyone knew that the palace ran smoother when those at the bottom knew when to speak and when to forget they had ears. Down one hall, a door stood slightly ajar. Behind it, the low thrum of voices, not arguing, not yet, but close. The words floated out, muffled but not unintelligible. You paused, as if adjusting your sandals, pretending to fiddle with the strap, when really you were letting the words sift toward you. "He wants to abolish the grain subsidies," one voice hissed, male, reedy, tight with worry. "He'll have riots in the forum. The people are already starving. And yet he spends half the treasury on games and foreign stonemasons," replied another, deeper voice, older, layered with that dry sort of sarcasm only Roman senators seem to perfect. "Bread is for the stomach, but marble is for the ego." You moved on before they noticed you. It was enough to know they were meeting. The content didn't matter, not yet. It would come back around in whispers, and someone above you would eventually ask if you had heard anything unusual. The trick was to hear everything, remember everything, and appear as if you'd never heard a thing in your life. You passed under an arch into one of the smaller gardens. These were private spaces, meant to mimic paradise. Small fountains trickled lazily. Lemon trees leaned in from tiled planters. A peacock preened silently on the edge of the walkway. But the real beauty of the garden wasn't the design. It was the safety. No one plotted here. No one schemed where the wind could carry their secrets past the hedges. You let yourself sit for a moment on the edge of a stone bench. The sun had risen fully now, casting a pale glow on the leaves. Somewhere nearby, a lute began to play. Probably the Greek boy who played for the emperor's afternoon naps. The tune was soft, almost clumsy, but the effort made it charming. You closed your eyes for just a heartbeat. A cough brought them open again. Not near, but close enough to remind you where you were. You stood and resumed walking, winding back toward the central corridor. Passing by the door of the emperor's private chamber, you noticed a servant girl slipping out. Her face was flushed, her eyes downcast, hands clenching the folds of her tunic too tightly. You knew the look. It wasn't shame exactly, but something close. You didn't stop her. No one ever did. That was the unspoken rule. What the emperor did behind closed doors remained there unless it spilled into public view, and even then it was repackaged as poetry or comedy. People laughed at the absurdities of the court because it was safer than crying. The palace was waking fully now. You could hear sandals slapping on polished floors, laughter forced too loudly, a senator's voice booming somewhere he hoped it would be overheard. The cooks would be lighting fires. The bathhouse would be steaming. The scribes would be sharpening their pens to write down half-truths and royal edits. And through it all you would drift, listening, watching, remembering, pretending not to, because here in the emperor's house survival wasn't just about obedience. It was about perception, and you were very good at pretending you had none. You had almost made it past the main corridor when a voice called your name. Not loudly, but just loud enough to freeze your steps. In this place, hearing your name spoken aloud always carried weight. It meant someone had taken notice, and notice was rarely a good thing. You turned slowly, not wanting to appear eager, not wanting to seem reluctant. Just the perfect blend of readiness and neutrality, the kind expected of someone who belonged to no one yet somehow served everyone. It was Paulus, the older steward assigned to the Emperor's private kitchen, leaning against a fluted column with the expression of a man who knew more than he was ever willing to admit. His face was worn like soft leather left too long in the sun, and his tunic, though plain, was always clean. He beckoned you with a small motion of his fingers. No words, not here, not with guards nearby. You followed, keeping your head slightly bowed. Behind a carved door panel, hidden within what looked like a linen closet, was a short, steep stair. Not everyone knew it existed. Fewer still were invited to use it. At the bottom was one of the smaller sculleries, quiet now except for the gentle bubbling of a covered pot and the creak of the stone walls adjusting to the heat. Paulus handed you a small scroll sealed with a dark red wax, the imperial sigil faintly visible where the wax had begun to soften in the humidity. He didn't explain and you didn't ask. Both of you understood the same truth. Questions were dangerous in the palace. They clung to you like smoke and could be seen long after the fire had passed. You tucked the scroll beneath your tunic and exited through a separate hall, one meant for deliveries and dish boys. Less decorated, more honest. The smell down here was stronger, vinegar, fish brine, fermented grape must, but it was also comforting in its own way. Food didn't lie. A rotten egg was a rotten egg. It didn't pretend to be loyal or scheme to be promoted. It just spoiled, and everyone knew where they stood with it. Your destination was across the palace, a room near the library courtyard where the Emperor kept his astrologer, and, occasionally, his spies. The man who waited there now was neither. He was a freedman, once a slave like you, now elevated, employed in the delicate art of information. His name was Felix, though no one said it out loud unless they were trying to flatter him. He was small, quick-eyed, always smiling with only the top half of his face, as if his mouth had long since decided honesty was too risky. You gave him the scroll without a word, and he gave you a glance that said more than any sentence ever could. Something was happening, not yet, but soon. You left the scroll room slower than you entered. Evorge. Hallway now felt heavier. Every door you passed seemed to whisper. This was how it began, you realized. The quiet rearrangement of schedules, the subtle reassignment of servants, the sudden orders for fresh linen in the guest wing even though no guests had been announced. The Emperor was preparing something, or someone was preparing it for him. The difference didn't matter. What mattered was the shifting of the air, the way the palace seemed to be holding its breath. You passed through the outer atrium again, this time catching a glimpse of a senator's son walking arm in arm with one of the Emperor's nieces. They were too close, too careless. Their laughter echoed too loudly, and you could already hear the shape of the rumour forming. By tomorrow morning, someone would be pretending they hadn't seen what everyone saw, and someone else would be writing it down. The sun was higher now, slicing sharp light across the columns and warming the marble floors. You returned briefly to your corner in the servant quarters, not to rest, but to reflect. The palace was no longer just a place to survive. It had become a game board, and you were no longer content to be a pawn. You weren't foolish enough to think you could win, but perhaps, just perhaps, you could last longer than most. And as the bell sounded softly in the distance, calling the nobleman to midday meal, you rose once again and stepped into the dance of shadows, ears open, lips closed, heart steady. Because the Emperor's palace didn't just house power, it listened for it, and you had learned exactly how to speak in silence. The midday sun soaked the upper gardens in a haze of golden warmth. It wasn't the kind of heat that brought comfort, but the kind that made you sluggish, the kind that tricked you into believing the world had slowed down. In the courtyard just outside the triclinium, the Emperor's elite were already reclining beneath shaded canopies, their goblets full, their smiles fixed, their laughter practiced. You didn't need to be among them to know how the scene played out. Servants scuttled with trays of roasted quail, honeyed dates, and bowls of chilled fruit that had travelled half the empire to appear precisely on this table. Senators dipped their fingers in lemon water between courses and bragged softly of border battles they'd never seen. The emperor, always late to his own banquets, would arrive eventually with a fresh robe and a story carefully rehearsed to sound unrehearsed. His entrance would be received like theatre, and it was theatre. Every gesture, every toast, every pause between words had purpose, but you were not there for the performance. You were watching the wings of the stage. It was always more telling. The physician's assistant who entered then exited within 2 breaths. The guard posted near the eastern colonnade who had suddenly been replaced by another, quieter face. Even the slave girl assigned to the fruit bowl who'd been sent back to the kitchens just before the emperor arrived. That was how the true currents moved here, not in arguments or proclamations, but in small changes, imperceptible to anyone not trained to look beneath the surface. You moved along the outer perimeter of the garden, feigning concern with a lopsided potted fig tree that had always leaned a little too far to the left. No one noticed you, which was the point. As you knelt near the base of the tree, trimming a vine that needed no trimming, your eyes flicked to the left. Across the courtyard, seated among the nobles as if born to velvet, was Audius Vinianus. You recognised him not by his face, which was forgettable, but by the ring on his little finger. A serpent eating its own tail. He had been a minor administrator only a few months ago. Now he lounged beside the emperor's favourite uncle, as if he belonged there. That was another truth of the palace. Power did not rise gradually. It leapt. It landed like a hawk and took you by the throat before you realised you had been noticed. A man like Vinianus didn't earn his seat. He was placed there, which meant someone important needed him close, or needed him watched, or both. You made a note of it silently, placing the memory beside a dozen others from the last week. Patterns revealed themselves in time if you were patient, and patient you had learned to be. The meal wore on. Music drifted from the interior hall, soft lyre strings, a woman's voice humming along. The emperor had arrived now. You could tell by the sudden hush that followed, the pause between laughter. It would be loud again soon. He had that effect on people. You'd seen him once at a distance years ago, before you were inside the palace walls. He had ridden past in a golden chariot, flanked by men in gleaming armour and women in white robes. He looked like a statue then, like something carved rather than born. But now, having spent months moving through his house, through his world, you knew better. He was not a statue, he was a fire. Beautiful from a distance, dangerous when too close, and like all fires, drawn to things that burned easily. As the shadows stretched longer across the flagstones, you made your way back toward the inner hall. A low whistle stopped you near the servants' arch. Behind one of the carved pillars stood Amara, the quietest of the linen girls, with eyes like candlelight and a mouth that rarely smiled. She didn't speak, only tilted her head and handed you a folded scrap of parchment. No seal this time, just a line of text scrawled hastily in charcoal. It wasn't addressed, but you knew it was meant for the man in the scroll room. Felix again. Of course, your role, once vague and broad, had now narrowed to a precise thread running between people who pretended not to know one another. You tucked the parchment into the hem of your tunic and gave Amara the smallest nod. She turned and vanished into the corridor like steam. No words exchanged, none needed. The palace had its own language, and silence was its most fluent dialect. By nightfall, something would shift again. You could feel it. Like the tremble of air before a storm, it was subtle but undeniable. Someone's name would be whispered more than usual. Someone's absence would stretch just a bit too long, and you would be there, at the edge of it all, never quite inside the circle, but always close enough to hear its turning. By the time you reached the upper corridors again, the sun had slipped behind the domes of the capital, painting the sky in that strange pale orange Rome often wore at dusk. It was neither warm nor cold, neither golden nor grey. Just a soft in-between that made the city feel suspended, as if it too was waiting for something. The palace took on a different character in this light. Shadows lengthened along the mosaic floors, and the columns, once so proud and white under the midday sun, now seemed to lean slightly like tired men do after too much wine. The noise of the midday meal had faded into that hollow quiet that came between performances. But the silence was not peace, it was rehearsal. You made your way through the northern wing where the inner scribes and archivists kept their records, their scrolls wrapped in dyed ribbons and bound in walnut boxes lined with sheep's wool. Felix would be here by now. You didn't knock. You never knocked in this part of the palace. It wasn't done. You entered quietly, stepping across a faded rug that muffled your feet more than necessary. He was waiting by the desk, hunched slightly, pretending to be engrossed in a sheet of parchment that had clearly been sitting untouched for some time. When he looked up, his smile appeared fast but never reached his eyes. You held out the note Amara had passed to you. He took it with the same ease you might lift a fig from a bowl, as though it were nothing more than a detail. He didn't open it immediately. That was how you knew it mattered. Things that mattered were never read on impulse. They were carried, studied, turned over in thought before ink ever met eye. He tucked it into the inner lining of his sash, then dismissed you with a small nod. You didn't linger. As you stepped back into the corridor, the wall torch near the entrance flared slightly in the breeze. It flickered once, twice, then held steady. But you had already seen the signal. Someone was watching, again. The palace never slept, not truly. It rested, it hushed, it dimmed, but it never fully gave itself over to the night. In the dark hours, different roles emerged. The cooks retired. The senatorial staff wandered home under guard. But a new caste took the stage. Messengers moved more quickly. Attendants lingered in corners they had no business standing near. And those who had no titles but carried quiet authority began to step from shadow to shadow, speaking in half-sentences and glances. You returned to your quarters briefly, just long enough to wash the grime from your hands in a cracked basin and change your tunic. The one you wore had been stained with pomegranate juice from a tray you'd steadied earlier for a senator who hadn't even looked at you. That's how it worked here. The higher someone rose, the more invisible you became. You wondered, not for the first time, if one day you might learn to vanish entirely. Night came quickly. A silver light spread through the palace like spilled oil, coating everything in a sheen that made even the statues seem to breathe. A summons came not long after, whispered, not delivered. You were to report to the southern colonnade, near the reflecting pool where the emperor sometimes walked in the evenings with those he needed to charm or threaten. You arrived early. You always did. It was one of the small private rebellions you allowed yourself. To be prepared before the others, to know what the room would smell like before they filled it with perfume, to hear the waters ripple before it was disturbed by sandal or slipper. Felix appeared not long after, flanked by two young men you didn't recognize. Their clothes were simple, but their eyes were sharp. One of them had the look of a scribe, the other of a runner, legs thin as rope, face too alert for someone his age. Felix didn't introduce them. He simply said you were to accompany them to the temple district at dawn, deliver a parcel and return by midday. The parcel wasn't shown to you. Not yet. He would give it just before you left, folded in cloth and fastened with string. You weren't to speak to anyone. You weren't to be seen if it could be helped. He used those words specifically, and it struck you then that this errand was not part of your usual dance of messages and mutterings. This was something else, something that didn't want to leave a trail. You nodded once and said nothing as expected. Then you stepped back into the marble gloom, heart beating slower than it should. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and myrrh. Somewhere a torch crackled. Somewhere a man whispered. Somewhere a future shifted slightly on its axis, just enough to be felt by those who were listening. You did not sleep that night. Not because of fear, though there was a tremor of it curled somewhere low in your ribs, but because your mind would not settle. The palace had its own pulse, and you had lived among its rhythms long enough to know when it was quickening. Lying on your straw mat, you could hear it all. The late footsteps of a messenger carrying a torch too low. The soft murmur of guards exchanging shifts, their words clipped and cautious. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and was silenced. Even the moon seemed brighter than usual, casting its pale light across the floor as if it too had something it was trying to reveal. Just before dawn, you rose and dressed in the plainest tunic you owned. The cloth was thin and worn, the hem uneven from being patched too many times. It was the sort of garment one would look twice at. You tied your belt loosely and tucked your sandals under the folds. When you stepped out into the corridor, the air was cool and wet, clinging to your skin like a warning. A heavy mist had settled over the palace grounds, softening the edges of the statues and blurring the outlines of the columns. Even the torches lining the walkway gave off a dull, uncertain light, as though reluctant to disturb the morning silence. Felix was already waiting at the garden arch, a parcel wrapped tightly in linen pressed to his side. He didn't speak as he handed it to you, and you didn't ask what was inside. It wasn't your place to know. You accepted the weight of it and slipped it into the fold of your sash, where it rested against your hip like a stone that had always been there. The two young men from the night before stood off to the side, their expressions unreadable, their eyes scanning the shadows. They would accompany you to the edge of the temple district, and then you were to finish the journey alone. That too had been made clear. The streets of Rome at dawn were a different world. Gone was the press of bodies, the shouted prices of market stalls, the clatter of carts and hooves on stone. In their place was stillness. The only sounds were the slow sweep of brooms against the pavement and the occasional rattle of a door being unlatched by an early riser. The mist followed you, curling into the alleys and rising in thin tendrils from the stones, as if the city itself were exhaling in its sleep. You kept to the edges, your footsteps light, your eyes lowered. The others trailed behind you, far enough to be discreet, close enough to intervene if needed. But no one approached you. No one looked twice. And that, more than anything, told you how carefully this path had been planned. By the time you reached the edge of the temple district, the sun was beginning to pierce the fog in thin, golden streaks. The marble columns of the great shrines loomed above you, their tops lost in the mist. Statues of long-forgotten gods watched in silence as you passed, their faces worn smooth by time and reverence. You paused near the steps of the Temple of Concord, where an old man swept leaves from the base of a pedestal with a bundle of straw. He didn't look up as you approached. That was the signal. You slipped the parcel from your sash and placed it gently beside the potted laurel near the temple's wall. Then, without a word, you turned and walked away. You did not look back. You had learned long ago that looking back made people curious, and in Rome, curiosity was a currency best spent sparingly. As you returned through the lower markets, the city was beginning to stir. Bakers shouted orders to apprentices, and the scent of warm bread crept through the air like a promise. Children raced through alleys with wild hair and louder voices, and above it all, the palace began to reawaken, its domes catching the morning light, its walls beginning to echo once more with the voices of men pretending to be gods. By the time you stepped back inside the servants' gate, your tunic damp with sweat and morning dew, the parcel was gone, and the city had already forgotten you were ever there. But you hadn't forgotten, because something had shifted inside you, subtle but certain. You were no longer just a watcher. You were now a thread in the tapestry, and like all threads, you could be pulled. By the time the sun had fully cleared the rooftops and lit the upper terraces of the palace in sharp brilliance, you'd already been back inside for over an hour. You kept to the lesser paths as you returned, slipping behind columns and beneath stairwells, nodding only when absolutely necessary. The city had stirred to life around you while you made your way back, yet inside the palace, the day was only just beginning its slow theatrical unfold. The oil lamps that had burned through the night had been snuffed, and the faint scent of smouldered wick still clung to the walls. Servants moved quickly now, voices low, their pace brisk but never rushed. It was the hour when the nobles had not yet emerged from their perfumed chambers, when the real work of the palace, the hidden work, could still be done quietly. You passed the linen girls sorting robes in the stone washroom, their chatter light, their eyes darting toward you as you moved through. Not for gossip, not today. Today there was a tautness in the air, as if everyone felt the shift, though none could name it. Even the guards at the inner threshold seemed sharper, their hands resting a little heavier on the hilts of their gladii, their stares lingering a little too long. The wind that slipped through the open arches of the courtyard carried with it the sound of distant horns, not military but ceremonial. You paused, tilting your head just slightly, listening to the pattern. 3 short calls, a pause, then one long, not a general announcement. A summons, likely for a gathering of the inner circle. And if that was the case, then something was in motion. You didn't go to your quarters. Instead, you drifted toward the upper balconies where the newer stone met the older brick, where the renovations from the last reign had not quite masked the bones of the former. It was quiet there, always quiet, and from its vantage you could peer across the outer courtyard, where guests sometimes arrived by chariot, under escort. What you saw now, however, was no honoured guest. A litter, curtained but unmistakably official, was being carried toward the side entrance. The slaves who bore it wore no insignia. Their tunics were plain, their sandals dusty. But their coordination was flawless, and the 2 guards flanking the path were not palace guards, but men from the praetorian cohort. You recognised the stiff, calculated way they moved, and you recognised what that meant. Whoever was in that litter was important, and whoever had arranged for them to enter, unseen, was more important still. You stayed only long enough to see the curtain flick slightly, revealing a pale hand adorned with a ring too heavy for a commoner. Then the curtain fell again, and the litter disappeared behind the stone wall that separated the palace from the private baths. You pulled back into the shadows, heart ticking now in a steady beat that echoed in your ears. No one had spoken to you of this arrival. Not Felix, not Paulus, not even through the quiet chain of glances and gestures that normally carried such warnings, which meant either they had not known, or they had chosen not to let you know. Either way, it left a hole in your understanding. And holes were dangerous in this place. As you made your way back to the central wing, your mind turned slowly around the memory of that parcel. You had delivered it to the Temple of Concord as instructed, but you had not been told to whom it would go, nor what would be done with it. Now, seeing that litter, you wondered if the 2 things were connected. Messages rarely travelled alone in the palace. One secret always linked to another. It was how the system maintained itself through threads of quiet implication, never pulled too tight, never fully revealed. By the time you passed through the colonnade into the main atrium, the day had fully arrived. Voices echoed from the dining halls. The smell of roasted barley and sweetened wine clung to the draperies. And in the far corner, near the fountain shaped like Neptune's trident, stood a woman you'd never seen before. Her robes were simple but fine, and her sandals, though dusty from travel, were stitched with gold thread. She was speaking with a steward in hushed Latin, but not the court kind. It was the softer dialect, the kind spoken in the villas outside the city, by people who thought themselves far from politics. And yet here she stood, within the heart of the empire, eyes scanning the stone walls with careful, deliberate slowness. You didn't stop. You passed by as if you were nothing more than another servant fetching water or delivering robes. But she watched you, just long enough for you to feel the weight of her gaze. Whoever she wasn't here by chance, and something told you her presence, like the parcel you had delivered, would ripple outward in ways no one had predicted. You thought about her all afternoon, the woman in the dusty gold-threaded sandals. You could still see her standing there in your mind's eye, her robe just brushing the mosaic floor, her gaze deliberate but not openly hostile, curious but not naive. She had studied the walls like someone who had seen blueprints of the place long before her feet ever crossed its threshold. Even her stillness had purpose, as if each moment she lingered was calculated to leave a faint imprint, a gentle memory in the heads of those who passed her by. You'd only glanced once, careful and brief, but she had caught that glance. You felt it, not in the way people noticed each other out of boredom, but in the way you feel a hand hover near your back without touching you. A presence. That woman was a presence. And in this palace, presences only arrived when something was about to change. By the time your chores took you towards the rear courtyard, the sun was beginning its descent. Shadows cast by fig trees grew longer across the tiled paths, and the laughter of noble sons practicing archery rang through the upper hall. You moved silently as always, collecting a basket of folded linens to be returned to the eastern chambers. Most days you took comfort in the ritual of these errands. They grounded you, gave your hands something to do while your ears listened and your eyes wandered freely. But not today. Not since the parcel. Not since the litter. Not since that woman's eyes. The weight of things felt different now, as if the entire palace were breathing slower, preparing itself for a new rhythm. And you, as ever, would have to match it. You slipped down a passage seldom used at this hour, one that ran beside the Emperor's private gallery. You didn't intend to linger there, but as you passed, a sound caught your attention. Not voices, not footsteps. The scrape of something sharp, then a quiet laugh, low and stifled. You moved to the edge of the gallery window and risked a glance. Inside, behind a screen of gilded latticework, the Emperor's nephew, a boy no older than 16, was carving something into the leg of a marble table with a dagger. Beside him stood two other young men, both from noble families, both laughing a little too loud, as if afraid not to. The boy's face was flushed with wine, his eyes glazed, but focused as he etched crude words into state property. You couldn't read them from where you stood, but the rhythm of the laughter told you enough. This was not an innocent game. This was mockery, most likely of a senator, or of the Emperor himself. These boys had the arrogance of those who believed they were untouchable. But in the palace no one was. Not really. You made no sound and did not stay long. You knew better than to be caught bearing witness to something meant to vanish before morning. Back in the eastern chambers, the linens were placed without incident. The maids chatted softly, braiding each other's hair, dabbing perfume behind their ears with sprigs of crushed rosemary. It was a ritual that belonged to them, part of their world. You moved through it without leaving a mark. That was your way, in silence, in shadow. You returned the empty basket to the lower hall and paused only to draw water from the basin and splash it on your face. The stone of the basin was cold, the water even colder, but you needed it. Not just for the dirt and the dust, but for clarity. You looked at your own reflection for a moment in the ripples. You barely recognized yourself, not because your face had changed, but because you were no longer sure where you ended and the palace began. The night meal was being prepared as you returned to your post. From the kitchens came the thick scent of roasting lamb and citrus glaze. From the garden, the hum of lyres being tuned drifted on the wind. The sky outside had turned the colour of bruised peaches, soft and darkening. You moved through it all without urgency, taking in the details, watching the shape of things as they settled. You had the sense that this night, more than any other, would reveal something, not through words but through absences, through who wasn't where they were supposed to be, through rooms left too quiet, or faces that refused to meet yours. You returned to your quarters and sat by the small clay lamp, unlit for now, just listening. To the steps above, the water dripping somewhere in the walls, the steady hum of anticipation stretching like a wire beneath everything, a tremor in the calm, a breath being held, and somewhere in the folds of the palace, someone waiting for the moment to release it. The next morning did not begin as the others had. It lacked the sleepy murmurs of servants shaking off dreams and the usual rhythm of sandals brushing against worn stone as the day unfurled. Instead, the palace had woken in silence, a thick and deliberate quiet, like a theatre whose curtain had risen to an audience too afraid to breathe. You felt it as soon as your eyes opened, even before your thoughts had caught up with the weight of it. The light that poured in through the narrow window was no different, but the sounds around it had changed. It wasn't what you heard, but what you didn't. The usual sounds were missing. No laughter in the lower courtyards, no clatter of pails being filled, no idle humming from the older stewardesses. The stillness wasn't restful, it was bracing, the kind that arrived before words did. You dressed carefully, not out of vanity but precision. Your tunic was clean, pressed the night before with a stone warmed by the kitchen fire. You tied the cord once, then once more, tighter. Every movement was thoughtful. This morning did not allow for the usual blurred pace of routine. This morning was waiting to be read, and you would need every sense wide open. Outside your door, the hallway looked the same, but the faces that passed wore different expressions. Stiff, pale, eyes slightly too wide, hands kept deliberately to sides. It was the posture of those who had heard something but weren't yet sure what they were supposed to believe. That was always the moment before a storm in the palace, the collective breath everyone took as they pretended not to know they were holding it. You made your way toward the upper garden, not because you had business there, but because it offered a view not just of the grounds, but of the behaviour that shaped them. From that corner of the palace you could see who walked where, who entered whose door, who hurried and who lingered too long. It was a place not many went so early, and that suited you just fine. By the time you reached the stone bench near the herb wall, the sun had begun to soften the edges of the hedges. A fig tree rustled faintly behind you. In the garden below, a group of slaves was gathered by the olive trees. Not working, just standing. That was your first real sign that something was indeed unfolding. Idle servants were dangerous, and if they were allowed to remain idle, it meant someone hadn't yet decided how to use them, or worse, that someone had died. A moment later, confirmation arrived not in words but in movement. A squad of Praetorian guards, 6, all armed, all walking in formation, marched through the inner gate and split into 2 directions, not patrolling, searching. You followed the arc of their path with your eyes until they disappeared from view. The others in the garden did not look. They pretended to be engaged with plants, with pathways, with matters of no consequence. But you could feel the collective alertness, the tuning of the air, the knowledge that something had snapped or was about to. You left the bench and moved toward the kitchen corridor. If there were whispers, they would be there. The kitchens always knew before the senators. Food could be delayed or withheld or altered based on rumour alone, and the cooks were masters at reading the climate of scandal. Inside, the heat from the morning fires was already thick. Bread was rising slowly on long trays, but none had been placed in ovens. The head cook, a lean man with sharp fingers and no patience for idle chatter, was standing near the spice shelf speaking in low Latin, with a scullery boy whose face had gone almost as white as the flour on his hands. You waited until they moved apart, then passed near the boy and caught a single phrase soft as a feather and nearly lost in the steam. It was in the fountain, just the hand. He said nothing else, but that was enough. You left quickly, heart pounding, mouth suddenly dry. The garden fountain. Someone had been found. Not dead, perhaps, but changed, maimed, made into a message. A hand. That could mean so many things in this world. A warning, a punishment, a signal of betrayal, and though you didn't yet know whose hand it was, or who had sent it, you knew what it meant. The palace was no longer simmering. It had begun to boil. And in the midst of it, you were no longer just a servant, you were a witness. And witnesses, when they lived long enough, became historians, or ghosts. You didn't go to the fountain right away. That would have been foolish. Too many eyes were already drifting toward it, and in the palace, curiosity was never innocent. It was a mirror, reflecting who'd noticed what and who pretended not to. Instead, you made your way toward the corridor that overlooked the western portico. From there, you could look down into the garden without seeming to. You kept a piece of linen in your hand, made a show of wiping the dust from the marble banister, giving your presence the shape of duty. And as you worked in silence, you waited for the scene to shift below. It didn't take long. 2 guards had already been posted at each end of the garden. They weren't speaking. Their spears stood like extensions of their arms, unmoving, and their eyes never met. A few palace workers still moved through the space, but they moved faster than usual. No idle conversation, no pausing to admire the olive trees or flirt beneath the vines. There was a thinness in the air now, like a sheet stretched too tightly. You could feel it, even from above. Then came the procession, not of nobles, but of silence. 4 officials in dull robes entered, led by a man whose name you didn't know, but whose face you had seen before. He belonged to the Office of Records, one of those who walked beside power without ever directly touching it. That was what made them dangerous. They knew everything and said nothing. One of the younger scribes carried a cloth bundle, wrapped tightly and held away from his body like it might still bite. He placed it on the edge of the fountain, and 2 others leaned in. They did not unfold it. Not yet. You didn't need to see inside to know what was there. The boy in the kitchen had been clear enough. You didn't stay to see them lift the cloth. You already understood what it meant. A hand in the garden wasn't just an act of violence. It was a signature. It said someone had been close enough to kill, and confident enough to do it with style. That was how things worked here. Death was less about finality and more about message. Someone had sent a warning, and now everyone would begin the scramble to decide who it had been meant for. The guessing would become strategy, the strategy would become rumour, and by nightfall, people would be realigning their loyalties with frantic subtlety. You made your way back down through the East Hall, this time passing Felix near the Basilica entrance. He wasn't alone. A man you'd never seen before stood beside him, tall and foreign-looking, his tunic stitched with a pattern that suggested wealth, but not Roman. The man didn't speak, just handed Felix a thin strip of parchment and walked away without ceremony. Felix watched him go, his mouth tight, his hand still at his sides. You could feel the weight in the space between them. That message, whatever it contained, was not ordinary, and Felix, who rarely betrayed emotion, looked troubled in a way that made your stomach twist. He saw you. Of course he did. His eyes flicked toward you as if he'd known you'd be passing. You made no move to acknowledge him, and neither did he. That was how it worked between the 2 of you now. Quiet recognition, unspoken trust or something close to it. But that glance told you enough. He would speak to you soon, when it was safe, and what he had to say would matter. By midday the palace was buzzing, not with noise but with restraint. People spoke in clipped phrases, in doorways, behind fans, in the corners of halls where statues couldn't listen. The Emperor had not made an appearance, which was unusual. He never missed an opportunity to reassert his presence after a scandal. His silence was louder than most decrees, and the Empress, usually heard laughing in the solarium with her cousins, was nowhere to be found. The only sign of her was a fresh wreath placed on her statue in the garden. It wasn't a gift, it was a signal. She was watching, always. That evening, just before the sky bled into violet, you found a folded note in your quarters, pressed beneath the edge of your mat. There was no seal, no signature, but you knew the hand. It was Felix. The message was short. 2 words. Come quietly. So you rose, stepped out into the dimming light, and once again slipped into the shadows, where the real Rome lived and whispered. You moved without hesitation, feet soft on the stone, body folded into the rhythm of silence. The note had given no time, no place, only the instruction, and yet you knew where to go. It was always the same when Felix summoned you in this way. Not through the formal channels, not through coded glances in the corridor, but through a simple message that bore no weight in ink but carried the full weight of consequence. The air had cooled as you slipped past the servants' gate, and the scent of the evening was heavy with olive leaves and distant smoke. Somewhere nearby, incense was burning, thick and resinous, the kind used in rituals, not mealtimes. It clung to the breath, sat on the skin, marked you without asking permission. You passed the statue of Livia near the bath complex, its face chipped just slightly beneath the left eye. Most ignored it, but you had always found that crack comforting, as if even marble could carry its burdens. From there, you followed the covered walkway that wrapped around the peristyle, then dipped into the lesser corridor behind the grain ledger rooms. The guards did not watch you pass. They knew you, or more accurately, they had learned not to question you, not because of your status, of which you had none, but because men like Felix had allowed you to exist uninterrupted. And in the palace, that was a kind of power. He was waiting in the scriptorium, though the scribes had long gone for the night. The room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp on a table covered in scrolls and styluses. Dust hung in the air like breath suspended in water. Felix did not look up as you entered. He was tracing his finger along a line of text, the kind written hastily by someone who believed it would be burned after reading. But this one had survived, and it had landed here. His other hand rested on the table, motionless, as if grounding him against whatever words he had just absorbed. You didn't speak. You never did until he did first, and when he did speak, it came softly, but with a weight that silenced even the thoughts in your head. He said that the hand in the garden had belonged to a man named Aurelius Bracker, a lower-ranked advisor tied to one of the financial committees, someone who rarely made waves, someone who never dined with the emperor directly, but who had recently come into possession of a record of irregular accounts, grain shipments listed that never arrived, funds redirected to contractors who did not exist, and a pattern, if one knew how to look, that pointed toward a name no one said out loud unless they were ready to be buried alongside it. You felt your chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but with recognition. Because it was the Empress's steward who had signed the releases, not directly, never foolishly, but through a cousin, through a loyal friend, through one of those layers of deniability that insulated the powerful. Bracker had known, or had guessed, or had been persuaded to know, and now his hand had become a symbol floating in the garden basin. Fingers curled not in agony, but as if still clutching something. Felix stood slowly, his eyes heavy with calculation. He handed you a small wooden token carved with the imperial seal on one side and the symbol of the Vestal Order on the other. He said nothing more, only that you were to take it to the shrine on the eastern slope where one of the elder priestesses was waiting to receive something, or to give something. It was not yet clear. What was clear, though, was that you were not just running errands anymore. You were ferrying pieces of a puzzle that, once complete, would either shield you or swallow you whole. As you stepped back into the corridor, the lamplight flickering behind you, you heard voices echo down the stone hall. Not toward you, but moving, urgent. Someone else had been summoned. Someone else would be told. The web was widening, threads pulled tighter. You slipped the token into the pouch at your waist and headed toward the eastern slope without stopping to eat, without stopping to rest. The night was cooling fast now, and you could feel the weight of the palace behind you pulsing like a giant animal that had just started to stir. And somewhere, in one of its deeper chambers, the Empress would soon notice that another hand was missing. Not a literal one, perhaps, but one she had once relied on, and she, too, would begin to move. You took the longer route to the eastern slope, not out of caution, but out of instinct. The straight paths of Rome were often the most dangerous. It wasn't the shadows you feared, but the clarity of being seen under torchlight. The nakedness of movement when you passed through arches meant for ceremonial procession. The city, even at night, was never truly dark. The glow of fires burned low in courtyards, and the watchposts always kept their torches high, casting long, flickering lines across the walls like restless ghosts. You stayed to the alleys, your pace unhurried, the token in your pouch pressing against your side with a quiet certainty. It had no magic, that piece of wood, and yet it carried the power of movement, of entrance, of being allowed into places you were never meant to see. By the time you reached the eastern slope, the bells had already marked the hour of the third watch. The temple grounds were quiet, but not asleep. Vestals kept odd hours, and though most of them were cloistered deep within the sanctuary's walls, one or two always remained near the outer altars, tending the fire or reciting chants barely louder than whispers. You moved toward the oldest shrine, the one tucked near the garden wall where ivy had begun to reclaim the stone. It was here you had been told that the elder priestess sometimes came at night, away from the politics of the court and the ceremonial duties expected of her. You found her seated near a small clay brazier, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her eyes already fixed on you before you even stepped fully into the clearing. She was older than you expected, not frail but still. Her presence was not one of command but of certainty. She did not ask your name, she simply reached forward as you approached, her palm open, as though she had been expecting you for days, not hours. You placed the token in her hand, and for a moment, she simply closed her fingers around it, as if feeling its weight might tell her more than the message it implied. Then she reached beside her and lifted a small scroll tied in red twine. She did not hand it to you directly. She placed it on the stone between you. An old ritual, perhaps, or a boundary maintained even in secrecy. You took the scroll with both hands and gave a short nod. She said nothing more, and you did not linger. In the world of the Vestals, silence was not emptiness. It was respect. You stepped back into the soft night, the scroll now hidden in your tunic, its presence unfamiliar, almost hot against your chest. You didn't open it. You didn't need to. Whatever was written there, it was for someone else. Your job, as always, was to deliver, to move between the whispers and let the story unfold around you. One glance, one gesture, one parcel at a time. The walk back was quieter. The city had stilled more deeply now, as if resting before whatever the morning would bring. You took no satisfaction in the peace. You had lived in this empire long enough to know that calm was often the echo left after something was broken. And something had been broken, not just Bracker, not just his hand, but a balance, a quiet agreement that those who knew too much would keep quiet, and those in power would reward their silence. That agreement had been breached, and you were beginning to suspect that the tremor had come not from the Emperor or the Senate, but from the edge of power, from those who stood near it but did not sit at the table. Back inside the palace walls, you returned to the northern wing. The halls were empty now, the tapestries motionless, the torches nearly guttered. But as you passed the carved doorway near the Chamber of Tribunes, you saw something that made you pause. A sandal, small, embroidered, set just outside a room known to be unused. A woman's, certainly, and not the kind worn by a maid. You did not open the door, you did not knock, you simply looked at it for a long breath, then continued on. But you knew, as surely as you knew your own name, that the woman who had arrived in the gold-threaded sandals had not left. She was still within these walls, and wherever she walked now, the ground behind her would not be the same. The morning that followed felt like it arrived before its time. The air was still cool, heavy with the damp breath of dawn, and yet the palace was already beginning to stir, not with the usual clatter of servants or the light murmurs of those tending the fires, but with something more measured, more restrained. The kind of movement that happens when people expect to be watched. You felt it the moment you opened your eyes, as though the walls themselves were more alert, leaning inward, listening. You had returned from the eastern slope only a few hours earlier, the scroll now resting behind a loose stone under your cot, and you hadn't yet decided when or where it would be delivered. Felix hadn't summoned you again, which in itself was unusual. He never left a thread dangling, but the quiet from him now felt intentional, as though he too was waiting for something to settle before stepping forward again. You washed quickly, wrapped your tunic tighter, and stepped into the hall. The sandals that had been placed outside the chamber last night were gone. No sign of them now. The door was still closed, and no noise escaped from within, but the absence spoke just as loudly. Someone had entered without fanfare, and someone had left in the same way. Or perhaps they hadn't left at all. Perhaps they had simply vanished deeper into the palace, as some people did when their presence no longer served a surface purpose. You filed that detail away, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. The woman with the gold-threaded sandals had a shape that was beginning to stretch itself across the palace like a shadow cast by a torch. Her steps, though soft, were beginning to rearrange the furniture. Your errands that morning took you to the West End, where the kitchens had begun their daily rituals. The scent of ground coriander and garlic clung to the air, mixing with the sharper tang of vinegar used to clean the wooden surfaces. You passed through without speaking, as usual, but the conversations around you were thinner, stripped of their usual rhythm. Even the cooks were whispering. You caught a fragment of one exchange, something about an imperial cousin who'd been sent away without warning, his chamber cleared in the night, his guards reassigned to the wine cellars. Not banished, no, that would have caused too much noise. Just removed. Shifted. Like a pawn nudged quietly off the board. From the kitchens, you moved toward the Eastern Records room, not because you had business there, but because it was the only corridor that crossed paths with Felix's inner post. And sure enough, as you turned the corner near the Frieze of Mars in battle, you caught sight of him. Alone this time, standing beneath the arch with one arm braced against the wall and the other holding a bundle of scrolls. He did not look up as you approached, but you slowed your pace just enough for your shoulders to nearly brush. He murmured something low, too low for anyone else to hear. For midday, North Gate. That was all. You didn't nod, didn't pause, just kept walking, as though the words had passed through you unnoticed. Back in your quarters, you waited until the light from the upper window struck the wall beside your mat. That was your measure of time in this place, more reliable than any bell or shadow stick. When it came soft and slanting, you retrieved the scroll. The twine had not been touched since the priestess had handed it to you. You didn't open it. You hadn't even let your eyes linger on its edges. That was how it worked. The less you knew, the safer you remained. But even without reading it, you could feel the tension it held. Like coiled rope, tight and waiting to snap. At the North Gate, just before midday, the guards were pretending not to notice anything. Their eyes stayed fixed on nothing in particular. Their hands rested lightly on their belts, and they spoke with just enough ease to make it seem like an ordinary shift. You passed through quietly, pressing the scroll into the palm of a courier who stood beside a wagon filled with amphorae. He didn't speak, didn't even glance at your face, just tucked the scroll inside his belt and walked away into the crowd as though carrying olive oil and not a thread of imperial consequence. You remained there for a while, blending into the background as carts rolled by and children chased pigeons through the dust. You waited not because you expected a reply, but because you needed to watch the world move on. That was always the trick of it, seeing how life continued, even as secrets passed invisibly through its veins. When you finally turned to leave, the sun had crept higher, and the palace loomed again in the distance, still golden, still proud. But now you could feel it beginning to tremble, just slightly, as if bracing itself for the unravelling. By the time you returned to the inner compound, the sun had pressed itself high above the rooftops, turning the marble courtyards blinding white and sending the scent of hot stone drifting lazily through the air. The palace looked like it always did in the full light of day, grand and unbothered, with its columns proud and its floors scrubbed to perfection. But as your feet slipped across those polished surfaces, you could feel the current underneath, tugging gently, instantly. It was like walking across still water while knowing a deep tide pulled beneath it. People moved with care now, even those who were used to swagger, minor dignitaries, mid-tier commanders. Even the wine merchants seemed to lower their voices and shorten their greetings. No one wanted to be noticed. Not today. You passed through the corridor where the tapestry of the triumphal march had been recently restored, its edges no longer frayed, its colours bright again, almost unnaturally so. As you looked up at the stitched scene, rows of soldiers, captives with their heads bowed, the emperor riding tall in his chariot, you felt a faint unease. Not at the image itself, but at how easily triumph could be woven and rewoven to suit the moment. The faces on the cloth had likely belonged to real people once, but here they were, reduced to thread, stitched into victory without protest. The way back to your quarters took you past the administrative wing, a place where slaves were usually invisible unless something had gone wrong. It was meant to hum along quietly with the machinery of paperwork and tribute calculations. But today, the air there was taut. As you passed one of the marble arches, you caught sight of an argument unfolding, not loud but tense. Two men, both in formal robes, one with the insignia of a provincial tax office, and the other wearing the seal of the Emperor's Internal Accounts Division. You didn't hear their words clearly, but you caught fragments. Missing ledgers, overlapping payments, and a name, Cassianus, a name you'd heard before, though never spoken openly. He was rumoured to be one of the invisible ones, the kind whose power lay not in being seen, but in being remembered only by the weight of their decisions. You didn't slow, but you listened. Always listening. And by the time you reached the stairwell, you were already folding those new names and connections into the map in your mind. The map was growing more crowded now, threads crisscrossing and tangling, the web stretching tighter. Somewhere, at its centre, a spider sat still, waiting for the right vibration to strike. You wondered who it would be. Later that day, as the shadows lengthened and the heat of the sun began to soften, you were summoned again, not by Felix this time, but by one of the outer attendants who usually ran errands between the kitchens and the stables. He found you near the southern atrium, handed you a folded piece of linen marked with a tiny circle of black wax, and walked away without waiting for a reply. The circle was not an imperial mark. It was older, subtler, and you had seen it only once before. It belonged to the Empress's informants, or at least those who acted in her name. The note was brief, barely more than a breath. Come to the Violet Chamber, dusk. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. The Violet Chamber was not often used, reserved for favoured guests or quiet discussions with no official trace. You had been there once, years ago, to deliver fruit to a visiting noblewoman who had left Rome under mysterious circumstances 3 weeks later. The room had no windows, only high vents carved into the upper walls, and the ceiling painted with a soft blue meant to calm the eyes. You had never liked it. It felt too still, too watched. When you entered at dusk, the chamber was already scented with lavender and something sharper, cypress oil perhaps, or myrrh. The woman was seated near the far wall, not cloaked in shadows but in something quieter, confidence. She wore no jewellery, her hair bound in a braid that curled like a serpent at her collarbone. It was her. The woman whose sandals had lingered outside the empty chamber. The one who had watched you without watching. She did not rise, did not speak immediately, only studied you with the kind of gaze that made you straighten without knowing why. And when she finally did speak, her voice was low, steady, and carried the rhythm of someone used to being obeyed without raising it. She said your name, your real name, the one you hadn't used since before the palace had swallowed you. Then she smiled, just a little, and told you that everything you thought you were delivering these past weeks had been moving in 2 directions at once, and that now it was time to choose which direction you would follow. You didn't respond at first. When she spoke your name, the one buried beneath layers of obedience, anonymity, and routine, it felt like a thread that had been pulled from some tightly woven part of your life. You hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in so long that it echoed strangely in your ears, as if the chamber itself had repeated it in a soft murmur, like dust stirred from the walls. You didn't flinch, but you could feel something shift inside you. You stood still, heart steady but alert, as if waiting for a second voice to speak from the shadows. But there was no second voice, only hers. She invited you to sit, motioning with her hand toward the low stool opposite her. It wasn't a command, nor was it a casual gesture. It was the kind of invitation you don't refuse unless you're prepared to disappear entirely. So you sat, not too close and not in the direct path of the perfumed smoke rising from the brazier near her feet. You watched her, studying not just her face but how she held herself, how her fingers rested lightly on the folds of her robe, how she blinked with unhurried precision. Every part of her presence was built to disarm without appearing to. She said she'd been watching you for some time, not personally, not always, but through others, through the reports passed quietly down corridors, through the notations made in margins of daily logs, through those who noticed your silences more than your words. She said you moved like someone who did not belong here, and yet had made yourself indispensable as she. That was a rare quality. Most servants either blended until they were forgotten, or rose too quickly and burned out under the gaze of power. But you had walked a narrow line, seen things without being seen, delivered messages with the discretion of a diplomat, and remembered more than anyone expected you to. And now, she said, it was time to stop walking the line and step onto the path. You didn't ask her what she meant. She didn't want questions. She wanted her to see if you understood her without being told. That was how this world worked. There were no explanations, only invitations. And the moment you asked for clarity, you proved you didn't belong, but you did understand. The scroll from the priestess, the token, the messages, the hand in the fountain, each one a movement in a larger pattern, and now the pieces were starting to converge. She told you something that would have sounded like a riddle to anyone else, but to you it landed like a blade laid gently across the wrist, not cutting but cold enough to warn. She said the Emperor no longer trusted his reflection, that every night he had the mirrors in his chamber covered before sleep, and each morning he asked the same question before opening his eyes: who spoke in the dark? You'd heard rumours of his declining health, of whispered names spoken too freely near the baths, of scribes who had been replaced without farewell. But this was different. This wasn't illness. It was fear. And fear, she said, was the final currency. The only one that never inflated, never lost its value. She leaned in slightly then, not enough to be intimate, but enough to draw your attention to her eyes. She said she needed someone to continue doing what you were already doing, moving without noise, seeing what others missed, knowing who entered whose chambers and which messages took too long to arrive. But this time not just for Felix, for her, and not just within the palace walls. She wanted to know what was spoken in the market, in the corners of the taverns, among the litter-bearers and spice vendors. She said the Empire did not live in the Senate or the courts, but in the spaces between, the places where truth walked without sandals. When she finished, she stood slow and deliberate. She did not wait for you to respond. She only told you to return to your duties, but to listen differently now. That was all. Then she walked past you, her sandal brushing against the stone, and she disappeared through a narrow door hidden behind a tapestry you hadn't noticed until she touched it. You sat for a moment longer, alone now, the scent of lavender fading slowly into the air. Then you stood and left the chamber without a sound, feeling the palace stretch and twist around you like it had always done. But now with new dimensions, you were no longer just a shadow moving through the halls. You'd been seen, and worse, you'd been chosen. The corridors felt different now. You had walked them 1,000 times, memorized the irregular stones underfoot, the way certain sconces leaned slightly to the left. The faint sound of dripping water near the latrine arch that never seemed to be fixed. But this time, each corner felt like it held an ear, each flicker of torchlight a glance. It wasn't paranoia, not quite. More like awareness, sharpened and newly born. She had given you no emblem, no instructions written in wax or stamped with an official seal, only a look and a promise spoken without the weight of request. But her voice lingered behind your eyes now, each word curling into thought like smoke slipping through a keyhole. You weren't sure if you had accepted her offer or simply failed to refuse it. Perhaps there was no difference. That night, you returned to your quarters slowly, taking the longest possible route along the back walls of the palace. You passed the doorways of men who would never learn your name, but whose secrets you had watched unravel over time. You passed the fountains and statues they believed immortalized their glory, and the quiet gardens where their enemies whispered beneath the guise of evening strolls. You passed them all with the same silent tread, not looking too long at anything, not showing the world that your pace had changed. But it had. You were no longer just walking, you were scouting, testing the wind, measuring silence. When you reached your cot, the lamp had been lit by someone else. You could smell the faint citrus oil used to clean the wick, something no one in your rank would bother with. On your mat was a folded cloth, plain but fresh, and tucked beneath it a piece of dried fig wrapped in wax paper. A gift, but not of affection. This was a message from someone who did not want to be seen near you, but needed you to know they had passed through. There was no note, but the gesture spoke loudly. You placed the fig in a small jar on the shelf and folded the cloth with slow, deliberate hands. Someone had entered your room, left no trace, and exited without alerting the guards. That alone narrowed the list of suspects, but it was the choice of fig that told you more. Only one stall in the market sold that variety, imported from the southern coast and steeped in honey during transport. It wasn't a gift for a servant. It was a symbol of surplus, a reminder that while others scavenge for scraps of safety, some could afford to leave luxuries in shadows. You slept little that night, not out of fear, but because your mind wouldn't settle. It ran in circles around the woman in the violet chamber, her eyes steady and her questions unspoken. Around Felix and his quiet messages, his trust given carefully, piece by piece. Around the man in the accounts division who had argued so fiercely near the tapestry of conquest. You knew that palace politics were never truly separate from the people who washed its floors and carried its candles. You'd seen too much to believe in that kind of divide. But now you were being asked to live inside that blurred space fully, to gather not just movements but motives, to observe not only who whispered to whom but why. Before dawn you slipped into the southern corridor where the apprentices to the bath attendants took their morning shifts. You weren't expected there. You never were. But you made yourself useful, as you always had, helping carry fresh linen, lighting torches, offering a steady hand without drawing attention. It was in these moments, amid the steam and the chatter, that people spoke most freely. One of the younger attendants, barely more than a boy, muttered that the Emperor had asked again about the sounds in his chamber, this time swearing he had seen movement in the mirror just before the cloth was drawn across it. Another spoke of a senator's wife being seen at the temple of Kabyle, weeping, though no one close to her had died. The older bath slave nodded and said she wasn't mourning a person but a promise, that someone had broken an oath to protect her husband, and now he had been quietly reassigned to some remote outpost in Germania. None of it seemed like more than gossip, unless you listened to the tone, unless you had been told recently that the Emperor feared his own reflection. You lingered long enough to help with the bronze basins, then slipped away again, this time heading toward the storage vaults beneath the lower kitchens. There were fewer eyes down there, and you needed time to think. As you moved through the cool underground hall, your fingers brushed the scroll that remained hidden beneath your outer robe. You hadn't delivered it yet, not the second one, the one passed to you not from the priestess, but slipped beneath your mat after your return, and you were beginning to wonder if its contents were meant not to be read, but to be intercepted. The vaults beneath the lower kitchens were not meant for lingering. They were cold and heavy with the smell of brine, grain dust and old amphora wax. The ceiling was low in places, and your footsteps echoed too easily against the bare stone, though no one above seemed to ever hear them. It was the kind of place where sounds went to sleep. You'd come here often in your years within the palace, usually to deliver or collect something, but never before had you stood still down there with nothing in your hands. The scroll was still tucked under your robe, a small quiet burden that seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. It felt different from the others you'd carried, not only because of its weight or the way it had been delivered, but because of the silence around it. No one had followed up. No nod from Felix, no second token, just that wax seal pressed lightly against your ribs, pulsing like a quiet heartbeat. You leaned against a column and stared into the darker part of the vault, where light never reached. For a moment you listened, not for footsteps, but for your own breath, steady and measured. You'd been trusted before, but this was different. This felt like being tested. Someone wanted to know how far you would go without instruction, how far your loyalty stretched when no one was watching. Perhaps they wanted to see if you would break the seal, if curiosity would overtake caution. Or perhaps it wasn't curiosity they feared at all. Perhaps they were waiting to see if you'd pass it along to the wrong person, if you were the sort to choose allegiance over survival. Your fingers brushed the edge of the scroll again. The parchment was stiff, as though it had been kept hidden for some time before reaching you. If it had been intercepted by someone before you, it would explain the stillness that followed its appearance. Messages within the palace were like sparks in a dry field, quick, destructive, and impossible to fully contain. Yet this one had arrived in searts, as if it were meant not to ignite but to smoulder slowly. You were beginning to wonder if you were not the courier this time, but the experiment. A voice interrupted your thoughts. It came from the corridor behind, low and familiar. You turned to see Marcus, one of the older servants from the ledger wing, standing near the steps with a small bundle under one arm. His presence wasn't suspicious. He managed the grain records and had reason to come to the vaults, but the way he looked at you said he hadn't expected you there. Not alone? Not like this. You greeted him softly, as was custom, and pretended to busy yourself with one of the nearby amphorae, lifting its lid to check for the usual supply of salted fish. He said nothing for a while, only moved toward the racks and began counting jars, a task he could have delegated to one of the boys, but here he was, doing it himself. After a moment, he asked if you had heard the latest about Cassianus, the man tied to the financial irregularities. Rumour had it he'd left the palace grounds under escort, but not for exile, for a reassignment. Something about needing his expertise in the coastal ports, but everyone knew what that meant. It was a clean exit, a quiet removal, and it told you something important. Someone was covering tracks. You nodded without replying, letting the news settle like dust. If Cassianus had been removed, someone else had likely taken his place already, someone more loyal or less curious, and if the message you carried had anything to do with that shift, then your movements were now tied to a much larger game. Marcus didn't press. He was good at that. Good at dropping half-truths like stones in a pond, letting the ripples reach you without demanding a reaction. When he left, you remained a while longer in the vault. The silence returned, but now it felt heavier. Not the comfort of solitude, but the awareness of being watched without seeing eyes. You had the scroll. You had the knowledge that someone else had entered your quarters and placed it there. And now, with Cassianus removed and Marcus's subtle probing, you knew time was tightening around you. You climbed the steps with careful footsteps, back toward the dim firelight of the lower kitchens. You weren't ready to deliver the scroll yet, but you were ready to find out who had sent it. And to do that, you'd have to retrace steps no one wanted remembered. It meant pulling at threads left dangling in rooms that were swept too often and asking questions in voices barely louder than breath. But you would start, because now, whether you wanted to or not, you had stepped into the game fully, and the next move was yours. It began with a list, not a real one, not something carved or inked or pinned to any surface. It was the kind of list you carry in your mind, made up of moments, glances, irregularities that seemed meaningless when isolated, but pressed together formed a crooked map. You started there, quietly gathering threads while pretending to carry out the same duties you always had. Cleaning brass bowls, delivering messages, filling jugs with watered wine. But your eyes were now tuned to subtle dissonance, and it didn't take long before the pattern began to reveal itself. There had been a servant named Lisa, a quiet woman with clever fingers who used to work near the Eastern Study. She vanished 3 weeks ago, supposedly sent to tend to the vineyards outside the city, but no one had seen her leave, and her cot remained untouched for 2 days before it was reassigned. There was an aide to the steward of the stables, young, nervous, who once carried scrolls for Felix. You hadn't seen him since the day of the hand in the fountain. No mention of where he'd gone, no whisper of punishment or promotion. And then there was that kitchen boy, the one with the scar on his neck. He'd been caught stealing dried herbs months ago and had been flogged for it. But he remained after that, oddly favoured by the same kitchen master who had ordered his punishment. Now he too had disappeared. You didn't need a full list to know something was being cleaned. Not violently, not all at once, but with quiet precision, like trimming the edge of a tapestry so slowly no one noticed the shape changing. You thought of the woman in the violet chamber, her voice, her posture, her certainty. She had known this was happening long before you did. Perhaps she had even started it. The thought didn't bring comfort. It brought responsibility. You'd been pulled into something that was already in motion, already running ahead of you, and now you had to catch up or be left behind in the kind of silence that didn't echo. So you returned to the last place you had seen Liza, the Eastern Study. It wasn't a grand room, more of a tucked-away scriptorium that served as overflow when the main archives became too crowded. It was also where Felix once kept temporary records, scrolls that weren't ready to be logged but couldn't be discarded. The kind of papers that lived in the space between importance and forgettability. You arrived near the end of the day when the sun hung low enough pour gold through the narrow window slits. No one else was there, and the door creaked only slightly when you slipped inside. You walked the rows slowly, letting your hand drift over the wooden cases, pausing here and there, not to search but to remember. Lysa had worked the back table, near the cracked stone where the mortar never seemed to hold. You stood in her spot and looked around. Nothing out of place, nothing missing. But the quiet was too still. The air here was heavy with the smell of ink and old parchment, and underneath that the faintest note of lavender, the kind used in the Empress's quarters, not strong enough to be deliberate, just a trace as if someone who didn't belong here had passed through wearing the wrong scent. You knelt and ran your fingers along the base of the table, finding what you didn't expect to find. A small fragment of twine, twisted and flattened. Red twine. You recognized it. The same kind that had sealed the scroll you had delivered to the priestess on the eastern slope. The same shade, the same fine twist. It meant something. It meant that what you had carried across the palace wasn't the only one. Others had moved like you, quietly, unseen. Lysa had been to part of it. Maybe the kitchen boy too. Maybe even Marcus, though you couldn't be sure. But now they were gone, and you were still standing. Which meant one of two things. Either you were more trusted than they were, or you were the last piece left to fall into place. You didn't take the twine. You left it there, where no one would look, and walked out with the knowledge folded tight inside your chest. The list in your mind had changed again. The names weren't just missing now, they were signals. Each absence had been a step in a larger choreography. Each silence a punctuation mark in a sentence no one had read aloud. Yet. And as you made your way back toward the inner courtyard, dusk pooling like ink behind the columns, you caught sight of Felix near the colonnade. He wasn't alone. He was speaking to a woman in deep blue robes. She turned just enough for you to catch the edge of her face. It was the same woman, the one from the violet chamber. She looked directly at you this time, not with surprise, with expectation. She didn't look away, not even when Felix shifted slightly in front of her, his shoulder tilting as if to block her view of you. But it was too late. The moment had already passed between you, and in that brief exchange of eyes, everything else in the colonnade dissolved. You knew what she had just told you without saying a word, that this was no longer about observation or errands or silent deliveries. You were being drawn out, not by force, not yet, but by presence, by visibility. They were placing you in the light, one sliver at a time until there was no more shadow to hide behind. You continued walking, not changing pace, though the blood in your neck had begun to warm in that way it did when something shifted beneath your feet, when the stone of certainty began to turn soft. You didn't look back, didn't give Felix the satisfaction of a nod, nor did you linger long enough to invite an encounter. The conversation they were having would continue with or without your attention. You would be brought into it when the time suited them, not before. So you moved, passing through the inner courtyard where the orange trees had started to bloom again, their blossoms sending that gentle, sweet perfume into the evening air. Somewhere behind the hedges, two young slaves laughed too loudly before catching themselves and lowering their voices. Even joy in this place required caution. Your thoughts wouldn't settle. They came like wind on the Tiber, pushing in gusts, pulling in conflicting directions. If she and Felix were aligned, that meant the structure of your world was tighter than you had imagined. You'd thought of them as separate voices, two differing currents of influence that occasionally brushed one another but never truly merged. But if they were speaking directly now, in open view, it suggested something far more orchestrated. And if you were still being allowed to witness it, even by accident, it meant you had not yet been dismissed, that you still had value, or that you were about to be tested in a new way. That night you sat outside the storage chambers near the lower quarters, staring into the basin where olive oil was poured each morning to be rationed. The surface was black now, catching the moonlight in soft glints. The quiet there was a welcome thing, not empty, but safe. The kind of silence you can rest inside, and as you sat there you thought about the list again. Not the names this time, but the pattern of it all, the way information moved, the way people vanished, The way certain scents, certain fragments, like a fat twine in the scriptorium, tied places together that weren't supposed to know one another. You remembered how Lyta once hummed when she copied scrolls, a tune so steady you could time your steps to it from 2 chambers away. How that tune had gone quiet, not just from absence, but with deliberate erasure. As if someone didn't want you remembering it. You wondered if there were records of these people. Somewhere, buried deep in Felix's possession, or perhaps even farther beyond, in the private ledgers no one touched without blood permission. A soft scuff of footsteps behind you broke the stillness. You didn't startle. It wasn't fear that made your spine straighten, but recognition of the rhythm. Felix approached alone, no torch, just the pale glint of oil from the wall sconce catching the edge of his cheek. He didn't speak immediately, only stood there a moment, looking at the basin with you. When he did speak, his voice was tired but not weary. There was still edge in it, still purpose. He told you the woman's name, Cassia. No title, no lineage, just the name as if it should be enough. Then he said she had asked about you more than once, and that was unusual. She wasn't the sort to waste time on servants, not unless they had stopped being servants. He watched your face when he said it, as if he expected you to react, but you didn't. You couldn't afford to anymore. He handed you something then, a thin scrap of parchment smaller than usual, unsealed, folded once. Inside was a single name, one you recognised, not a friend, not an enemy, someone you had observed more than once delivering messages to the senatorial wing, someone who had once carried a coin marked with the steward's signet and had been seen walking alone through the columbarium garden after hours. The message was clear. Follow them. Watch. Do not interfere. He turned and left without waiting for a response. And you sat there a moment longer, the parchment soft in your fingers, the air cooling as the night deepened. Cassia, her name now stitched to your path. And this new task, dropped so casually, was no longer just about information. It was about loyalty, about choosing where your shadow fell and who stood beside you in the dark. The name on the parchment wasn't one you needed to write down to remember. It had already lived in the edges of your attention for weeks, if not longer. Pulcher, a name too ironic to be accidental, worn by a man whose movements lacked elegance, but whose eyes never missed a moment. He was one of those men whose role was never clearly stated. Technically, he belonged to the staff of Senator Claudius Marcellinus, but his duties wandered strangely through different corners of the palace. Sometimes he appeared near the archives. Other times you spotted him in the library chambers where records of grain taxes were copied and stored. Once, weeks ago, you had seen him at the arena, not in the stands, but down in the shaded stone hallways where the performers waited for their turn to entertain guests of the court. He never smiled, but he never appeared angry either. He was, in every way, forgettable to those who didn't already know to watch him, and that made him dangerous. Felix hadn't asked you to do anything dramatic, only observe, stay close, unnoticed. But you'd already begun to understand that even quiet assignments carried weight, and nothing in the palace was ever simple. You started that very evening, pulling the sleeves of your tunic lower to better blend into the nightwork crew sweeping the corridors. From the upper terrace windows, the palace glowed in places, casting long yellow strips of light over the marble paths and bronze door frames. You slipped into those shadows like oil into cracks, moving where the candles didn't touch. Pulcher was in the north wing that night. He was walking with a deliberate pace, not hurried, not lazy. He paused once near the chamber of petitions, where a statue of Fortuna stood half-lit in torchlight, her face tilted in eternal mockery of fate. He didn't enter the room, but remained nearby, his hand resting lightly against the wall, as though he were waiting for something to happen there, or listening for something only he could hear. Eventually he moved on, and so did you, keeping your distance. You followed him as he crossed into the corridor that led toward the private balconies of the senatorial apartments. Access there was restricted, but you had ways of blending. You carried a bucket. You kept your head low. You turned your body slightly so the markings on your tunic looked like those of the laundering staff. It wasn't disguise. It was manner. The way you walked, the way you didn't look around, that was what protected you. Pulcher stopped again, this time near a chamber you had once seen occupied by a visiting scholar from Alexandria. It was dark now, empty. He lingered near the doorway, placing something small at the base of the frame. You were too far to see what it was, but the movement was precise, familiar, the way messengers left tokens to signal the next step in a code. Not a message to be read, but one to be recognized by the right person. A marker. And once he had done it, he turned and walked away, not back the way he came, but down a servant's passage normally used for food deliveries. You let him go for now, because the object at the doorway was more important. You waited until the hall was quiet again, until the torchlight dimmed behind the curve of the stone arch. Then you approached. What he had left wasn't paper. It was a chip of red tile, old and slightly curved as though broken off from a larger mosaic. One side had been blackened with soot, the other etched with 3 dots in a triangular pattern. It meant something, you were sure of it. Not a language you knew, but a signal. Something left for another to find, to understand. You took it carefully, held it in your palm, and then tucked it into the folds of your tunic, making sure not to be seen. You returned to your quarters much later that night, your body tired but your thoughts racing. The chipped tile sat on your cot, catching the moonlight through the high window. It wasn't just about Pulcher anymore. It was about the network he belonged to, the quiet trail he left. Not with words or open meetings, but with fragments and codes and placements that only a select few would recognize. And the deeper you followed that trail, the more certain you became that you were walking alongside something old, something that had lived in the palace long before your time, shifting shape and loyalty, pulling threads while others believed themselves to be the ones holding the spool. And now, holding the tile between your fingers, you began to wonder whether you were still an observer, or if you had just stepped fully into the weave. By morning, the tile still sat on the edge of your cot, its etched pattern faintly catching the light that filtered through the high lattice window. You had not slept, not properly, and you didn't bother pretending otherwise. Sleep, even when it came, would bring no peace. Your thoughts swirled too thickly, like oil clouding clean water. You held the tile again, turning it over in your fingers, and thought not about what it meant, but who had left it, who it was meant for, and what sort of language it belonged to. There were a dozen codes within the palace. Some were old tricks passed among slaves to mark safe corridors or warn of hostile overseers. Others were used by those in the imperial cult, layered in religious metaphor, impossible to decipher unless you understood the rituals. But this felt different. This felt like a current running beneath them all. You slipped the tile into your sash, nestled against the scroll you still had not delivered. The 2 objects weighed on you in different ways. One was meant to test your hands, the other was meant to test your silence. And now they seemed somehow connected. Pulcher's movements, Cassia's gaze, Felix's cryptic orders, they all folded into one another like threads in a pattern too large to see from where you stood. But you could feel it, the pull of it. Something was beginning to close in or open up. You weren't sure which, only that it was drawing you deeper. Your first task that morning was simple, or so it seemed. Deliver 2 amphorae of diluted wine to the midday table for the visiting Gallic envoy. A ceremonial gesture, not meant to impress, but to maintain form. You carried the jugs yourself, though you could have passed the duty on, gave you reason to move freely, and more importantly, to listen. The envoy himself was unremarkable, a man with a coarse beard and a fondness for speaking over others. But what caught your attention was not his voice. It was the quiet discussion between his scribes and the steward of the palace archives, barely above a whisper, conducted in the shadow of a column while others laughed at the table. Something about names removed from the official lists, tribes that had paid their taxes but now found themselves marked in arrears. It was being dismissed as a clerical error. But nothing in Rome was ever just a mistake. Someone was adjusting the narrative. You filed that away, another knot in the thread. After the table was cleared and the delegation led away, you returned to the empty courtyard behind the western kitchens, space rarely used except to dry laundries on breezy days. There, propped against the low wall, was Marcus again. His expression was unchanged, the same blank stare he had worn in the vaults, but this time he was the one waiting. He nodded once at you, then at the stone bench beside him. Lee, you sat, not because he asked, but because you understood this was a conversation that needed stillness. He asked if you had seen it, the tile. You didn't answer, not directly, only shifted your weight slightly, just enough to let him know that yes, it had passed through your hands. He didn't press. Instead, he told you something you hadn't expected, that Polka had once been in service to the Empress herself years ago, when she still held real power in the court, that he had vanished for a time after hers, influence waned, only to reappear in service to a senator whose loyalties were always vague, always drifting with the wind, that Polka had been many things to many people, a courier, a listener, sometimes even a witness to confessions made in the dark corners of imperial rooms, but never, not once, had he been trusted by the same hand twice. Marcus stood then, brushing dust from his robe, and told you that the tile was a mark used by those who called themselves the Circle. He said it like it was common knowledge, but you'd never heard of them, not by that name. He only smiled when he saw the question in your eyes. The Circle, he said, wasn't an organisation, it was a memory that refused to die. People bound by silence and favours, older than the Emperor, older than the palace itself. They didn't work for anyone. They worked to maintain a kind of balance, even if that balance cost blood. And if Polka had begun leaving signs again, it meant that someone, somewhere, believed the balance was tipping. When Marcus left, you remained. The wind had picked up, stirring the laundry that hung across the courtyard, making it ripple like sails waiting for a storm. And in that fluttering hush you understood that you were standing at the edge of something ancient. Not just intrigue or politics, but a way of seeing the empire that no history would record. And you were no longer just a witness to it. You were becoming part of its memory. The idea of a circle that moved beneath the palace stone like roots beneath a garden stayed with you long after Marcus was gone. You didn't speak of it. You didn't even mouth the name to yourself, as though saying it aloud might make it disappear, or worse, take notice. The wind tugged at the linen sheets above your head, and the scent of crushed thyme drifted up from the stone walkway where a cook had tossed yesterday's trimmings. You stood slowly, brushing off the folds of your robe, eyes tracing the seam between sunlight and shadow across the wall. The palace was always playing with light like that, letting it stretch just far enough to seem inviting, but never so far as to offer warmth without risk. You had lived in that middle space long enough to know what it meant to stay balanced. Your thoughts returned to Pulcher and the strange triangular mark on the tile, but they didn't stop there. They wandered to Cassia, to her steady gaze and the way she had spoken your real name like it had never been forgotten. They wandered to Felix, who now stood too close to power to be untouched, and yet still trusted you enough to drop names into your hands without instruction. And they wandered to the others who had vanished, those whose silence had become permanent. It occurred to you that none of these people were acting alone, not even Cassia. They were all weaving something together, their threads tightening behind doors you had never been invited to open. And yet, now here you were, holding pieces of it, that evening, while the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the braziers in the servants' corridors began to flicker to life, you made your way to the southern edge of the imperial grounds. Not far from the outer garden wall was an old storeroom, mostly forgotten, once used to keep wine casks during festivals. Its roof sagged slightly, and vines had begun to claw their way up one side, but the lock on the door was newer than it should have been. You'd noticed it days ago in passing. You only now understood why it had stayed in your memory. You circled it once slowly, pretending to examine the wall for cracks. Then you knelt beside the stones and pulled a small, smooth shard of tile from your sash. You pressed it flat against the lowest stone, leaving it there. No note, no symbol, just the same gesture Pulcher had made the night before. Then you stood, turned, and walked away without looking back. If they were watching, they would see. If they weren't, they would hear of it soon enough. The next morning arrived without incident. You awoke before the light had touched the courtyard tiles and slipped into the rhythm of routine as if nothing had changed. You polished the copper basins, checked the storeroom tallies, and fetched figs and almonds for a minor magistrate's breakfast, though he would never know who had brought them. That was the thing about service here. Your hands were everywhere, and yet your face belonged to no one. But that morning, as you passed beneath the arched walkway between the eastern chambers and the bath complex, you noticed something had been moved. It was subtle. A small potted laurel that usually stood flush against the wall had been turned slightly, its leaves pointing west rather than south. To anyone else it meant nothing. A clumsy gardener, perhaps. But to those who understood the quiet signs, it meant the message had been received. You didn't smile. You didn't allow yourself that. But something settled in your chest, a kind of weighted calm. The circle, if it truly existed in the way Marcus had described, had noticed you. And now the next move was not yours. You'd stepped into a dance where someone else led, and your job now was to move in rhythm, not to get ahead of the steps. So you returned to your regular tasks with renewed focus, not out of obedience, but out of necessity. Every detail mattered now, every scent carried on the breeze, every change in the guards' patrol, every messenger whose sandals bore dust from beyond the palace. They all became part of your new ledger. Late in the afternoon, as the sun made long gold streaks across the marble floors, you were summoned to the western corridor to deliver scrolls to the legal scribes. It was not unusual work, but when you arrived, one of the junior scribes gave you a tight-lipped glance and handed you not just one, but 2 scrolls, both bound in twine marked with a subtle crimson thread. Your fingers brushed it and you felt it immediately. A mirror of the twine left behind in the scriptorium weeks before. This was not coincidence. The crimson was deliberate. You took them without a word and carried them along the upper stair, the route that passed behind the statuary room. It gave you a moment of silence as you walked, the hush broken only by the echo of your own steps. You didn't stop. You didn't look around. You simply followed the corridor, as you always had. But the presence of that thread pressed against your palm, a quiet weight. Not a warning, a summons. Something was coming. You didn't know what form it would take, only that the palace had begun to turn slowly on a wheel older than you could name, and now your shadow moved with it. The next hours passed in a slow unfolding, each moment layered with that peculiar stillness that only the palace could offer. Not Zen's exactly, but the type of quiet that lives in marble walls and between glances exchanged by people who never say what they mean aloud. You delivered the scrolls with a neutral face, receiving no instructions in return. The senior scribe who accepted them barely met your eyes, though his fingers lingered a half-second longer on the crimson twine, before slipping it from the parchment and dropping it into the basin of sand beside his desk. That was it. No thanks, no question, but it was enough. Enough to tell you that the signal had passed, that you had served again as an invisible wire stretched between larger hands. You didn't return immediately to your quarters. Instead, you walked the long way back, passing through the corridor behind the conservatory. The garden windows were open, letting in the scent of crushed mint and the soft clatter of distant wind chimes. Somewhere nearby, a group of women laughed behind a screen as they prepared ceremonial wreaths, their voices hushed but still carrying the kind of warmth that had no place in the sharper corners of court. You let the sound move through you, not because it soothed you, but because it reminded you that some lives here still felt soft, unscorched by the undercurrents you now lived among. And then, just as you stepped beneath the arch leading into the eastern wing, you saw it, a figure you hadn't seen in weeks. Lysa. She was seated alone at the far end of the courtyard, half hidden by a trellis of ivy and shaded by the stone arm of an ancient statue. She wore no mark of her former post and her tunic was plain, as if she now served in the kitchens or laundry. But you would know that posture anywhere. Shoulders tense but deliberate, hands folded just so, head tilted, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. She hadn't vanished after all. She had shifted, been moved, repurposed, placed where no one would expect her. It struck you then that disappearance in the palace didn't always mean death. Sometimes it meant reassignment. Sometimes it meant deeper placement. You didn't approach. To do so would be to acknowledge her openly, and if she had gone to such lengths to remain unseen, she would not thank you for disturbing the veil. But she glanced up just once, catching your presence like one might catch the scent of smoke in a familiar room, and her eyes did not widen. They did not flinch. They simply confirmed what you had suspected. She knew. She knew you had seen the signs. She knew you had chosen to follow them. You walked on. There was no need to speak. Not yet. That brief flicker of recognition from Lysa stayed with you long after your feet had carried you away. You didn't need to see her again to know that her reappearance wasn't an accident. The circle, if that was truly what moved beneath the palace like a second pulse, did not place people without purpose. Her role now, obscured beneath a plain tunic and quiet routine, meant she was no longer just a watcher. She was a thread stitched deeper into the seams of this place. You wondered then, with a quiet tightness in your chest, how many others you passed each day who wore the same disguise, how many names you had forgotten that now moved again beneath new faces and new roles. The palace recycled everything: clay, cloth, rumour, and people, it seemed, were no different. That evening you returned to your quarters only to find the scroll you had hidden days ago was gone. There had been no signs of forced entry, no disturbance to the careful placement of your few belongings. The mat was uncreased, the corner stone where you sometimes tucked spare parchment still cool and undisturbed. And yet the scroll, folded beneath the straw mat and wrapped in a linen scrap, had vanished. There was only a single mark in its place now, pressed into the dust by the side of the cot, a ring-shaped impression, faint but deliberate, as though someone had worn a signet and leaned just enough to leave its echo behind. You stared at it for a long while, not with fear, but with something colder. Acceptance. They had taken it, and they had done so cleanly. You were being reminded again of your place in this hierarchy of silence. You were not at the centre, not even close. You were a spoke in the wheel, important perhaps, but still replaceable. And yet the sign they had left was not a threat. It was a signal, a way of saying the message had been received, that it had reached the hands it was meant for, and that your part in this particular chain was complete. You weren't sure if you should feel relieved or uneasy. Outside the wind had shifted, carrying with it the cooler breath of early autumn. The palace always changed with the seasons, not just in temperature but in mood. Summer brought boldness and risk, open courtyards and wine-soaked feasts, but autumn drew the palace inward, made the voices softer, the steps quieter. Secrets were easier to carry in colder air, and it seemed now that the pace of things was changing. You were being drawn deeper, yes, but you could feel the space tightening too, as if the paths available to you were narrowing with every step forward. You sat beside the lamp, staring into the low flame, and let the quiet settle. If they had the scroll, they had the questions. If they had the questions, they would soon come for the answers, and you were now too far in to be ignored. For 2 days nothing happened. You moved through the corridors with the same practiced steps, answered the same quiet summons, nodded to the same guards, and poured wine for men who spoke of provinces and coin as if they were discussing harvest yields. On the surface everything remained intact, but underneath the stillness took on a new weight. Not calm, but pressure. It settled on your shoulders like a garment woven from unspoken expectations, and you carried it without complaint because that was what the palace required. You knew enough now not to mistake quiet for safety. In Rome, silence was an instrument, and you had learned to read its tune. On the third evening, as the last sliver of sun clung to the horizon and the lamps were being lit one by one, a small girl passed you a folded scrap of parchment near the stairwell beside the grain chamber. She said nothing, only placed it in your hand with the solemnity of a priestess offering a blessing. Her face was unfamiliar, but her movement was precise, trained. She disappeared into the lower halls before you could even blink. You didn't open the note immediately. Not in the open, not with the wind curling so freely through the cracks of the old stones. You walked a while, pretending to search for a dropped key or a missing jug, and when you reached the quiet alcove behind the faded mosaic of Minerva, you crouched and read. The message was brief, a single line in an unfamiliar hand. Tonight, blue chamber, leave the door half closed. You burned the parchment with a nearby lamp wick, letting the ashes fall onto the damp stone, then walked on without adjusting your pace. The blue chamber. You knew it. Everyone in service knew it. Not because they entered it, but because they didn't. It wasn't marked by rank or assignment, but by absence. Rooms that were cleaned too quietly, visited too seldom, guarded too casually. The ones where important decisions passed like a whisper between candle flames. You had passed its outer corridor many times and had never once seen anyone enter or exit. That sort of invisibility required influence. You waited until the hour turned deep, when even the echoes of kitchen laughter had stilled and the fires in the high braziers were nothing more than breathing coals. Then, without fanfare or hesitation, you made your way through the inner passageways, the kind servants used not for shortcuts but for not being seen. The torchlight along the blue chamber's hall was dim, flickering, casting long, slow shadows on the decorative tiles. You approached the door, laid your hand against it, and gently eased it open, stopping just short of the hinge, half closed, and then you waited. The half-open door held more meaning than a dozen scrolls. It was a promise, a threat, a test. You stood beside it, your breath quiet, your pulse steady but present, waiting not for a person but for a signal. The passage behind you remained empty, and the torches along the walls flickered gently in the stale, dry air. The blue chamber itself remained hidden from view, and that was the point. Whoever stepped inside would do so with the understanding that they were entering something older than conversation, older than confession. It was an unspoken rule, one not written into any edict or decree, but in the palace, such rules were the only ones that truly mattered. When the figure finally appeared, you didn't turn. You heard the steps before you saw them, soft, leather against polished stone, deliberate, without haste. The rustle of fabric came next, a dry whisper like parchment being folded, then a pause. You felt her presence before you saw her. Cassia. It had to be. The same quiet gravity, the same air of someone who did not need to announce herself to be known. She stepped past you and into the chamber, her shoulder brushing yours, and for the first time she spoke to you without formality. No greetings, no titles, no rehearsed words, just your name, not the one used by servants or in the records, but your true name, spoken clearly, as though it belonged here more than you did. You followed her into the chamber. It was smaller than you imagined, lit only by 3 oil lamps placed carefully around the room. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, their threads once rich with colour, now dulled by time and secrecy. A single table stood at the centre, empty except for a small wooden box with a bronze clasp. Cassia stood behind it, her hands resting lightly on the edges, watching you with a gaze that was both assessing and familiar. She asked you nothing at first, only studied the way you stood, the way your eyes moved, the way you took in the space around you without asking questions. That too was part of the test. Then she told you what you'd suspected but never dared say aloud, that the palace was not ruled by the emperor alone, that power moved differently here, through hallways and gestures, through omissions and arrangements, that every visible act of authority had a shadow behind it, and that shadow had a shape, a rhythm, a logic. She told you that the circle was not an organisation but a memory passed from hand to hand, that they kept balance not through justice or law, but through necessity, and that your role until now had been to listen, to observe, and to prove you would not break. And now, she said, it was time to choose whether you would remain outside the circle or step within it. She didn't ask for an answer. She only opened the box. The inside of the box was unremarkable at first glance. No shimmering jewels or sealed scrolls waited within. Instead, there was only a small bundle of cloth, aged and fraying at the edges, bound with a corner felt like it held an ear, each flicker of torchlight a glance. It wasn't paranoia, not quite. More like awareness, sharpened and newly born. She had given you no emblem, no instructions written in wax or stamped with an official seal, only a look and a promise spoken without the weight of request. But her voice lingered behind your eyes now, each word curling into thought like smoke slipping through a keyhole. You weren't sure if you had accepted her offer or simply failed to refuse it. Perhaps there was no difference. That night, you returned to your quarters slowly, taking the longest possible route along the back walls of the palace. You passed the doorways of men who would never learn your name but whose secrets you had watched unravel over time. You passed the fountains and statues they believed immortalized their glory and the quiet gardens where their enemies whispered beneath the guise of evening strolls. You passed them all with the same silent tread, not looking too long at anything, not showing the world that your pace had changed. But it had. You were no longer just walking, you were scouting, testing the wind, measuring silence. When you reached your cot, the lamp had been lit by someone else. You could smell the faint citrus oil used to clean the wick, something no one in your rank would bother with. On your mat was a folded cloth, plain but fresh, and tucked beneath it a piece of dried fig wrapped in wax paper. A gift, but not of affection. This was a message from someone who did not want to be seen near you, but needed you to know they had passed through. There was no note, but the gesture spoke loudly. You placed the fig in a small jar on the shelf and folded the cloth with slow, deliberate hands. Someone had entered your room, left no trace, and exited without alerting the guards. That alone narrowed the list of suspects, but it was the choice of fig that told you more. Only one stall in the market sold that variety, imported from the southern coast and steeped in honey during transport. It wasn't a gift for a servant. It was a symbol of surplus, a reminder that while others scavenge for scraps of safety, some could afford to leave luxuries in shadows. You slept little that night, not out of fear, but because your mind wouldn't settle. It ran in circles around the woman in the violet chamber, her eyes steady and her questions unspoken. Around Felix and his quiet messages, his trust given carefully, piece by piece. Around the man in the accounts division who had argued so fiercely near the tapestry of conquest. You knew that palace politics were never truly separate from the people who washed its floors and carried its candles. You'd seen too much to believe in that kind of divide. But now you were being asked to live inside that blurred space fully, to gather not just movements but motives, to observe not only who whispered to whom, but why. Before dawn, you slipped into the southern corridor where, Ivy, the decision had been made. All that remained now was to accept it aloud. Cassia gave a slight nod, not approval, not encouragement, but acknowledgement, the way a wall accepts a shadow. She reached forward and closed the box, slowly, the way one might fold away a piece of history. And just like that, the ceremony, if it could even be called that, was over. There were no words of welcome, no oaths to bind you, only the quiet understanding that something irreversible had taken place. You did not rise right away. You let the silence wrap around the moment, letting it settle in your bones like a new weight you would carry from this point forward. The kind of weight that never truly leaves, even when forgotten. When you finally stepped out of the blue chamber, the hall was exactly as you had left it. The torches burned low and the corridor was still empty. But you felt the difference immediately. Not in the air, but in yourself. Your steps felt quieter, though you made no effort to soften them. Your breathing slower, though your chest was tight. You had not become someone else. You had only removed the part of yourself that had been pretending. Back in your quarters, you placed the cloth bundle beneath the tile at the base of your cot, where the dust remained undisturbed. You sat beside it for a long while, eyes unfocused, listening to the muffled sound of footsteps far above. Servants, guards, messengers, all of them moving with purpose, unaware of the chamber where the weight of their world had just shifted. You weren't afraid, you didn't feel triumphant either. What you felt was something older than those things, kind of stillness born of being seen and accepted by something too large to name, too quiet to worship. The circle had folded you in, not to protect you, but to use you. And in this world, to be useful was to live. You leaned back slowly, resting against the cool stone of the wall, eyes drifting toward the crack in the ceiling, where the last of the night breeze whispered through. Somewhere someone was already moving in response to what had been decided. You didn't need to know who. You would know when the time came, and the time would come very soon. By the next morning, nothing looked different, but you could feel that everything had shifted. The same hallways unrolled before you like unfurled scrolls. The same stone lions stared with blank authority from their pedestals. The same idle laughter trickled out from the dining chambers as scribes prepared speeches that no one would remember in a month. But beneath it all, there was a new current humming in the quiet spaces, as though the palace itself had exhaled and something older had been drawn into its lungs. You felt it even in the way people moved past you now, not watching, not wary, but aware. Those who knew had seen you pass through the unseen doorway. And though no words had been exchanged, no gestures made, you knew you were not just another shape in the corner. Anymore. You were part of the rhythm, and the rhythm was listening. The tasks of the day were unremarkable. A scroll to deliver here, a bowl of water placed at the foot of a statue there. A whispered message left on the corner of a senator's table without eye contact or pause. But each step felt more rooted than the last. You moved with the ease of someone who had ceased questioning their place. You were no longer tracing the edge of the map. You had crossed it. The circle had not given you power. It had simply revealed to you the architecture of it. The levers behind the throne, the pulleys behind the curtain, the weight behind each coin pressed into a hand. You had not changed. You had been unwrapped. Later that night, you turned once more to the storeroom wall where the first tile had been placed. The laurel nearby had been turned again, this time facing east. A different message, one you didn't yet understand, but it didn't matter. You knelt and placed nothing this time, only touched the stone briefly, as if greeting an old friend. The breeze that moved through the fig trees whispered gently above, brushing against the folds of your robe like a sigh. The moon hung low over the roofs, and the palace light shimmered faintly across distant courtyards. Everything looked like it always had, but now you knew its language. Back in your quarters, you prepared your mat as you always did, smoothed the blanket with practiced hands, and extinguished the lamp. As the darkness settled, you let your eyes close, not from exhaustion, but from calm. You had seen what most never would, not just the secrets of the palace, but the quiet dignity of those who guarded its balance, the fragile grace of silence used as a shield rather than a blade. Somewhere deep within the marble and the mosaics and the long columns that reached toward the sky, the circle would continue its turning. And now you turned with it. And as sleep wrapped its arms around you, the palace whispered not in fear or warning, but in welcome.